Welcome back from the coffee and indeed cake break. Thanks very much for being back punctually. Another great panel in prospect, and it's my pleasure to introduce the chair for this panel, who is CERRE Cardell, who is General Counsel of the CMA. She was appointed to that role in September 2013, i.e. the very beginning of the CMA, and is a member of the senior executive team and a key advisor to the board, responsible for all the legal advice across the CMA's functions. So with that, I will hand over to CERRE.
Thank you, and I feel slightly daunted being in such fabulous company, none of whom are lawyers, but I'm sure you will all introduce and discuss these themes with fascinating interest. I think we've had quite a few teasers for our discussions on interoperability over the last couple of days of discussions. I think it's been mentioned in pretty much every session that we've had so far. So really excited now to be able to open up and have a full hour to debate these issues. Quick introduction to the panel. Fiona Morton needs no introduction, professor at Yale, written and spoken extensively on interoperability. I think your latest paper, Equitable Interoperability, the super tool of digital platform governance, so raising the expectations there. Krämer, another author and discussion of interoperability in a recent paper on interoperability in digital markets. Jan is academic co-director at the Centre on Regulation in Europe and also professor of information systems at the University of Passau. We then have Cory, Doctorow, blogger, journalist, sci-fi author, I gather, as well. Cory has worked as the European Affairs Coordinator at the Electronics Frontier Foundation and helped establish the Open Rights Group, again written and spoken extensively on digital competition issues. And finally, we have Vittorio Bertola, engineer, policy expert and activist, currently running innovation and policy at the Open-Xchange. So I'm looking forward to a hugely exciting and fascinating discussion here on interoperability. Starting as a lawyer, I like to go back to basics a little bit. So starting with the simple points. For me, interoperability is quite simplistic as a starting point around just simply the ability for one product or service to connect, to plug into another. But I think we all know that it's a little bit more complicated than that, and that we have a range of different views around the benefits of interoperability, around the differences in the concepts, how far it should go, the scope, the benefits in terms of competition. We heard a lot of discussion yesterday about the interplay with privacy, with security, and obviously big questions around practical implementation. Conceptually, it may be a good thing, but how is that delivered in practice? And from my perspective, particularly at the CMA, what's the role of regulators and how well equipped are we actually to deliver this as an effective regulatory intervention? Before we get into some of the sort of deeper discussions, I'd just like to turn to Vittorio, though, who's going to give, I think, probably a slightly more technical version of my definition there of interoperability.
Well, no, your definition was great, but of course I am an engineer, so I have to be precise, and I want to add something. Yeah. And I will try to be succinct, but I'm Italian, so sorry. And well, interoperability is one of the key principles of the Internet since its beginnings. Actually, if you go to a document from the IETF, which was already mentioned today, and it's a standardization body for the Internet, exactly document RFC 1958 from the mid-90s, that's when, I mean, the leaders of the age from the technical architectural body of the Internet tried to basically write down the principles. And there are two that basically led to this idea of interoperability. One is modularity, so the idea that you should break down things into very small pieces, as small as you can. And the other one is standardization, meaning that once you find a way to create one of these modules and implement it, then the others should do it the same way, maybe not inside the module, but in the way it relates to the others. So the result, if you apply to these two principles, is that you create something which is the opposite of the traditional telco network, in which you had like a monopolist operator which would decide even which kind of phone you could connect to the network. And you get something which every possible supplier is just supplying you a very small part of the entire service and the entire network. And so you can pick a different supplier for each of the modules. And since they speak the same language when they have to talk to each other, you can actually combine things and modules and products that are made by different suppliers. And this is why the Internet creates competition, and it's why it could grow so quickly. And it could actually let people all over the world come up with companies, with products, with services, without having even to ask for a license or for permission. You would just invent a small module that would fit into these standard interfaces and start selling it or distributing it over the Internet. And this is how the key services that we know from that age, and we still use, like email or the web, were born, and this is why they could grow. And today, I mean, if you take email today or the web, these are interoperable services, meaning that, for example, you get an email account from any service provider that you want, and you can exchange email with any other user of any other service provider. Or with a web, you get a browser, you can pick among, well, not so many these days, but still you can pick among different browsers, and you can connect to any website. And this is the real meaning of interoperable. And if you compare this with the later services, the ones that were developed this millennium, and like social media, like instant messaging, these are fundamentally different because the market was already so different, and there were investors that really wanted to close it down and get as much money as they could. So this is why these services were built in a non-interoperable way, as walled gardens. And the meaning is that if you want to communicate with WhatsApp users, you need to use WhatsApp. You cannot use any other application. And then if you want to communicate with Signal users, you also have to have a Signal, and then you have to have Telegram. And each of these applications is not a technical problem. It could be built in a way that they talk to each other, but they were designed not to talk to each other, but because to protect their user base and to prevent the users from switching to another potential competitor. And this is why competition is not happening. And it would be much more efficient for the users to just be able to pick the best application and use it to communicate with everyone else, like you do with email, in which you can pick your service provider and your application, one or more, and use it. And so there are different ways to frame this. Then there are also different terminologies that we could use. We could distinguish, and I think other panelists will come to this, between vertical interoperability, which is the ability of a module to interact with other modules providing either functions like a browser with a web server, and the horizontal interoperability, which is really this interoperability between different implementations of the same service, like among different instant messaging. But the key message I really wanted to leave is that, there's a difference in which these services were conceived, and it's a difference which is connected to business reasons and not to technical reasons. And now we are stuck with this situation which we call multi-homing, the fact that you can actually install multiple applications, and this is just a poor man's substitution for proper interoperability. Because, yes, you can install many applications, but it's inconvenient. You start not to remember where you had a conversation with someone. And it's also not very sustainable in that, you have to use 5 times the resources on your mobile phone because you need 5 applications running at the same time. And in general, it's not also good for competition because you cannot really choose. You're still forced to have each of these, all of these applications, actually, if you have people on each of these applications. And you are forced to accept the terms and conditions of each of these applications, and you are forced to give your data to each of these service providers because you cannot really do without having these applications unless you want to give up and not communicate with your friends or contacts that are using them.
Thank you so much, Vittorio. And I'm just going to hold us in the present for a little longer, or perhaps take us back to the past a little bit, because Cory, it's very much a buzzword at the moment, interoperability, in terms of the way that digital markets are evolving. But of course, it's not a new concept for us, and it's something that we've seen as a regulatory intervention, a competition intervention and remedies historically as well. Could you perhaps just talk us through a couple of historical examples, maybe where it's been seen to work well, some where it's worked less well, and just draw some lessons from history for us before we look forward?
Sure. I think that when we talk about how we ended up with this winner-take-all internet, we tend to over-theorize network effects, which are in fact how you get firms that are very big. And we under-theorize switching costs, which is how you get firms that are durable and very big. Because while you've heard people say various things about how tech is not exceptional and we shouldn't be tech exceptionalists, there is something genuinely exceptional about digital technology, which is that it is universal, that the only computer we know how to make is the computer that runs all the software we know how to write, the von Neumann Turing-complete universal computer. And that means that historically, in the absence of rules that prohibit new market entrants from building interoperable products, it's always been just a game of cat and mouse, where a new engineer builds something and the engineers who work for the dominant firm have to figure out how to defeat them. And since attackers have an advantage in any security contest, because the attacker needs to find one mistake you've made and the defender has to make no mistakes, historically they won. So in the early 2000s, I was a network administrator. I worked for a bunch of SMEs as a kind of CIO for hire, and we had all these heterogeneous networks that were dominated by Windows machines, and we had a couple of Macs on every one of these networks, usually a designer, sometimes the CEO, and they were losing. because although Microsoft Office existed for the Mac, it was the most cursed piece of software Bill Gates ever allowed to ship. And if you got a document, it probably wouldn't open. And if you did manage to open it and save it again, no one would be able to open it except you for the rest of time. And this was a big problem. And we solved it at first by buying the designers a low-powered Windows machine and just having them have a document station next to their graphics station. But that was very unwieldy. And so we just beefed up the graphics cards, and we threw away the Macs, and we bought Adobe and Quark Express for those Windows machines. And the way that Steve Jobs resolved this was not asking Bill Gates to improve the build quality of Microsoft Office for the Mac. He had a team of technologists reverse engineer those file formats, and we got iWork Suite. And iWork Suite pages, keynote numbers, reads and writes all the Office files. They then launched a program, an advertising campaign, tellingly called Switch, that just emphasized the fact that the switching cost was now zero, that you could benefit from the network effects, that what had been a walled garden had now become a feedlot where Apple could go and gorge itself on Microsoft's formerly penned-up customers. And that was a turning point for the Mac. Now, of course, every pirate dreams of being an admiral, and once you've got up the ladder, you pull it up behind you. And so, as you heard yesterday, it's now very important that Apple stop anyone from doing unto Apple as Apple did unto Microsoft, because Apple are the good kind of trillion-dollar cuddly company, and Microsoft was the bad kind of trillion-dollar cuddly company. And it's true, it's often the case that Apple has your interests at heart, but sometimes they don't. And one of the ways to make sure that they do is to have the option to leave. And that is the thing that multi-homing does not get at, and that Vittorio just hinted at, which is that if the firm has policies you don't like, and they have locked up something that you cannot funge, something that you cannot substitute for, like your GRAN, inside their social network, then you will continue to use their social network because they are holding your GRAN hostage. And this is what interop gets you that multi-homing does not, is the ability to walk away from an abusive relationship with a vendor. So we've had instances where this has worked well. We've had instances where it's worked poorly. I only have a few seconds left, but I'll say briefly that the most notorious example of it working poorly is, I think, really just an example of notorious dereliction of duty, which was when we saw the AIM buyout and we saw Apple AOL make an interoperable instant messenger and promise to support it, and then just fail to do so without any meaningful consequences. And so what you ended up with was a very impoverished ecosystem. The main vendors decided not to play. The smaller vendors were forced out. And you got, I think, one of the great problems of administering an interoperability remedy that is based on mandating a standard, which is that when a firm doesn't comply or sabotages or foot drags, it is a fact-intensive question as to whether or not they are engaged in something nefarious or whether they're doing something that is merely so technically hard that it takes a while to get right. And by the time that fact-intensive question has been resolved, the new market entrants have been starved. The users who were unlucky enough to take a chance on those new market entrants have been disappointed. And the investors have learned the lesson that nobody wins when you bet against the house. And that's the end of it. And so later on, we're going to talk about administering interoperability remedies and different kinds of interoperability, because I do believe that there is this exceptional character to technology, this universality, and that this opens up new competition remedies that are otherwise lacking in other domains. You can't take your Bosch blender attachment and stick it on your Miele without a machine shop. But your neighbor can write a little bit of code that lets you run this program on that computer or access this protocol with that application. And you can download it and you can use it in a way that you can't use the Bosch to Miele adapter that your handy neighbor whipped up in their machine shop. And that is a unique remedy that is available to competition regulators in the digital space. And if we can figure out how to administer it and harness it, we can do things that are faster than all the other great remedies that are very important, like breakups and so on. AT&T, the first attempt to break them up came 67 years before the actual breakup. And so I hope that we can use more nimble tools to take account of the fast-moving technology and its unique characteristics to offer freedom to users that they don't have now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cory. And as you say, we'll come back to some of these.
And I did go a little long. I
That's
apologize.
all right. I'll let you off that one. Yeah, we'll come back to some of these really important issues, though, around the sort of practical challenges of implementation. And as you say, I think the real importance of learning from some of those historic experiences as well. Fiona, I think both Vittorio and Cory have sort of touched on some of the concepts that are really hot topics at the moment in terms of digital markets and interoperability, and particularly this question of how far we should go in using interoperability as a way to create and open up the market, create that opportunity for in-market competition. We talked a little bit about the constraints of multi-homing and network effects and switching costs. Could you just unpack for us a little bit some of these competition issues and how you see interoperability as addressing those?
Thanks, Sarah. I'll pick up from what Cory just said. If you remember Benedict Evans' series of graphs where we first had mainframes and then all the different technologies, that's competition for the market. Each generation of new technology, there's a bunch of entrants and they all try to be the winner and then they're going to be the monopolist. Another way, that doesn't yield great outcomes for consumers because we're in this monopoly space. We can't walk away from the abusive relationship. When will the next thing come along quickly enough? We don't know. So an alternative is to have interoperability where there can be multiple entrants and firms competing at the same time because the network effects operate at the level of the market rather than the firm. So we replace competition for the market with competition in the market. And that generates the ability for the consumer to walk away because your gran is not hostage anymore, to use Cory's words. It's therefore, particularly when you've got these entrenched platforms that we've failed to do effective antitrust enforcement on for the last 20 years, a really good remedy for the setting that we find ourselves in now. So if you thought exactly, if you took Vittorio's example of email and applied that to, say, social networks, personal social networks like Facebook.com, you can say to Facebook, look, the remedy is you have an API that allows messages. Let's say we define text and images and video and a calendar, and we standardize those bits as the small units. And then I could belong to, let's say, a social network that was a pro-social social network that designed the feed to be happy, make me feel happy and non-violent at the end of the day. And that would be where my account was housed. And then I could friend anybody across the whole network, including inside Facebook.com, and then I could receive their feeds. But my network would, of course, curate all of that information coming in so that it would have the quality I wanted and it would have the business model that I wanted. Maybe I don't want advertising. I want to pay a subscription fee. Maybe I want certain kinds of advertising. So you could see here that just like you can choose your ISP based on its business model and how expensive it is, I could choose my social network host based on differentiation and innovation and so on, and not be cut off from my grandmother. Okay, so that's the idea. That's an example of direct social network, direct network effects where we all want to talk to each other. You can also have interoperability working at the level of indirect network effects. So let's imagine there's a mobile OS platform and there's developers on one side and users on the other side, and the app store sits in the middle. Well, I could have my operating system have multiple app stores on it. And as long as the operating system is interoperable so that other app stores can get on there, then the developers and the users can choose which app store they'd like to access each other through. And again, we could have price competition. We could have curation competition. I could belong perhaps to an app store that was just very boring stuff for economists who don't need the latest fad, and that would make it simpler. Or I could have a Disney app store that some people want for their children or whatever. So you can think about that solving issues like the App Store or the NFC chip, and direct network effects for things like instant messaging and network effects. I'll make one more point, which is that I think we heard a lot of doom and gloom from Benedict Evans, who I think wants the perfect to be the enemy of the good, and interoperability isn't going to work as a regulation, and yet we have all these natural monopolies, which, normally in society when we have a natural monopoly like electricity or gas, we just regulate it. We say, here are the investments you can make, here's the product you can offer, here's how much you can charge. I'm guessing he doesn't like that either. So if you don't want to regulate it and you don't want to do interoperability, then I think you're stuck with everybody having just monopoly outcomes for the rest of their lives or all time, which is not, I believe, acceptable. I think we actually have the capability to regulate in an intelligent fashion. And one of the things that's quite nice about interoperability as a regulatory tool is that it doesn't require you to see the future. You can say, this is a general principle that's going to apply to lots of things for many years. And if we see the entrenched monopolist and we put in place the interface, which in fact the company probably has already built, as Cory will talk about later, then that's a light touch, easy way to give consumers choice without needing to be able to directly foresee what's going to happen in 10 years, yet having a guiding principle about what we're going to do with the next incumbent monopolist that arrives in 10 years. So I think it's just a really important and powerful idea, and has been around for a long time. Our phones work this way. When we had wired phones, it worked this way. Email works this way. It's not a new idea at all, but it's a really powerful idea because it transforms those network effects, which, as we've heard, are really different in digital, and makes them occur widely across the market instead of belonging as the property to one entrenched monopolist.
Thank you. And Jan, I can see you itching to come in there, but I know that you have some slightly different views in terms of the limits of where we should be using interoperability as an intervention, particularly perhaps on that sort of horizontal spectrum, but share with us your thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much. So probably the only reason I was invited on this great panel is because I have a slightly different view on the things. And so first of all, let me say, I mean, we really need to be careful when we talk about interoperability, what we're really talking about. So the distinction that Vittorio made in vertical and horizontal is really key, in my opinion. So vertical interoperability means that we're building systems that are complementary on top. So there's different app stores, for example, running on the same operating system. That's a vertical structure, and that's, economically speaking, very different from the kind of interoperability where you have two competing networks offering a substitutive service, and you're trying to make that interoperable. So two messaging services needing to become interoperable. I have no reservations at all about vertical interoperability, so I think that is really a great tool. It's been, have a history in telecoms, and actually, therefore, also see some of the things not really working well in telecoms, and I'll come back to that in the past, and that was this very simple service. So vertical is a good thing, but horizontal I have reservations about, horizontal interoperability. Why is that the case? Well, I mean, what we've heard so far was pretty much sort of the textbook case of horizontal interoperability. That means you have firm-specific network effects. You're going to defy those network effects by making things interoperable. Everything is fine, network effects don't matter anymore, and we're good. In reality, it's not quite like that. And I'll give you 4 reasons why it's different. The first reason is that interoperability in practice, and I would even argue especially for digital services, is never perfect. It's only going to be about basic features, if at all, and you always run behind the game in terms of making things interoperable. So let's stick with the example to be specific with 2 messaging services. Right? One is introducing, let's say, messages that delete themselves. After some time. That's not an interoperable feature. You can only use it on one network. So what does it mean? It means network effects remain. The dominant network, the ones that have most users, is still more attractive because you want to use the full set of features with the most users. You don't want to be on the tiny network that has only basic features you can interoperate with a larger network. Right? And if you know that interoperability is going to come as a regulatory remedy, then as a dominant network, you might even go specifically and design features such that they defy interoperability. You introduce encryption. Everyone likes encryption, right? But encryption makes interoperability more difficult. So the second reason is that interoperability in practice is really hard, even for seemingly simple services. If you think about interoperability in telecoms, it's a very basic service compared to the kind of services we're talking about. You have a connection or you don't. And yet, standardization in telecoms took years to come. And so that is, we shouldn't really be underestimating the technical difficulties. Everyone that's been involved, we talked about standardization bodies this morning, how standards, how long it takes to develop standards, to agree on standards. And then, and that's the third reason, even if you agree on a standard, if you've come to that path on compatibility somehow, it means basically the things are frozen in time. It's really difficult to change a standard once it's been established, especially in a federated system. And we're talking here not about really designing things from scratch a lot of time. So we're talking about interoperability, about systems that already exist. And they're not built with interoperability in mind. And yet, if you have a standard that's been enshrined, like email, for example, so of course we like email, everyone has email, but we would also like features in email that are not there. You know? No one's sending around encrypted emails. Why? Because everyone would be having to adopt a new standard as a collective action problem that's not getting resolved. Or we would like to have, retract an email after we've sent it. That's a feature we would all love, once in a while. It's not there because the standard is from the 70s, basically. And the fourth reason is that I would even argue there are circumstances where interoperability is anti-competitive. We've talked about the competitive nature of interoperability, but interoperability can be anti-competitive when things are not perfectly interoperable. Why is that the case? It's because the network effects remain. And some users will say, well, if things are interoperable, even a little bit, that's going to be enough for me. I'm not going to install that other messenger as well. I can send a basic test message. But that means the user is not multi-homing. It's not contributing to the network effect of that other messenger. And that means even more consumers will not be installing that other messenger. So interoperability means that it's reducing the incentives to multi-home. Now, Cory has been skeptical about multi-homing, but I'm actually very positive generally about multi-homing because in the digital sphere, multi-homing is very costless. It doesn't take a lot of money or effort, to install a second messenger. You can very easily do that. And contrary to Fiona, I think competition for the market is actually a good thing as long as we ensure that destructive, that supplanting of the incumbent, that transitioning from one monopoly to another is going fast enough. It's not being there for 10 years. Because with multi-homing you can use the full set of features on that network. You don't need heavy-handed regulation to interoperate. And you can have, for the full innovation incentive, keep those. And you can actually keep that competition for the market, which means you can actually, and we have a theory model to support that. Yes, there we have, just was run that bit. Yeah. We have a theory models to support that you can actually, the more efficient incumbent can actually win rather with multi-homing than with interoperability in some cases.
Thanks, Jan. Just help me a little bit. So as a regulator, we've clearly got some serious issues here that need to be addressed. I think the whole theme of the last day and a half's discussion is that we can't stand still. We need to find the right kind of interventions that are going to address some of these problems. And I hear the concerns around the risks of getting it wrong, the risks of sort of unforeseen consequences in terms of potentially chilling innovation, chilling competition, and that's clearly not what we want to achieve. But at the same time, it seems to me that we need to be prepared to be pretty robust in looking for an intervention that's going to unlock things, particularly in circumstances where it's not obvious that waiting for competition for the market is going to sort of deliver the outcomes. But Fiona, perhaps just a couple of thoughts in response to some of the comments from Jan.
So I actually 100% disagree, Jan. I think that where you see a bug, I see a feature. Imperfect interoperability is exactly what gives incentive for differentiation and innovation. If I can develop a messaging system that lets my children turn the picture of themselves to have blue hair or something, and that makes them excited, then they all join that, and it's fantastic. And then I can still message them, it's time for dinner. I don't need the blue hair feature. It's fine with me if my message arrives just in plain text. And so we've broken the bulk of the network effects because I can tell them it's time for dinner or we're meeting at noon. where there's still lots of incentive for that entering network to provide a value proposition. So you said it's anti-competitive because no one will switch to the entering network. Well, the entering network has to do something interesting, and then I will switch to them if they have blue hair, if they have encryption or something. So I think that that's all really good. Now, you say it's hard. So Andrea tried this on at Florence also. The people who say it's hard have to propose something they think is easier to regulate massive digital platforms that are entrenched. Like you could nationalize them and try to run them. That seems harder. I think interoperability is something we already know how to do. Look at Wi-Fi, look at Bluetooth. They're updated. What letter are we on for Wi-Fi? N or M or Q or something? And there's been a lot of generations of these technologies. The SSOs get together, they change it with great regularity. So we know how to do this. It's false that it's hard to change. And what that does, again, is lets the innovation go in a direction that business and industry wants it to go in and not some direction that government wants it to go in. In terms of also being anti-competitive, Jan cheerfully said, oh, well, we just have to make sure that the entrant comes along at the right time. Newsflash, the whole competition world is beating itself up for having missed Instagram. Facebook bought Instagram in order that Instagram would not overthrow Facebook.com. It's very difficult for a regulator to spot the nascent entrant that's going to compete for the market and overthrow the incumbent in time. Okay, so that's why I think interoperability has great promise, because the antitrust implications of competition for the market, the enforcement implications, are substantial. You have to be extremely good at your job. You have one chance every 15 years to get it right, because the new thing is coming along and it's going to overthrow the incumbent monopolist, and you can't mess up because the next one will be 15 years from now. And that's a very heavy burden to put on your antitrust authority, and it strikes me, therefore, that interoperability is a nice middle ground, not mandating what's going to come next, but leaving the market open so that innovation can come next. And may I say, the people on the last panel who said, we don't use Facebook.com, you must not have, for example, a child admitted to university in the United States who's told, oh, join the Yale class of 2022 Facebook page, and the school that gives out snow days on Facebook, and the village that runs every social event on Facebook. I mean, they've got hostages, as Cory was saying.
Fiona, thank you. I would like to bring Vittorio and Cory back in, but I suspect, Jan, do you want a 30-second right of reply?
Yeah, just on a couple of points. I mean, first of all, I mean, history from a lot of standardization things, telecoms tells us it's not that simple. Yeah, it's not that simple.
Well, I didn't say it was simple.
It's actually very hard, and you're always going to run behind, you're always going to be slow. I'll give you one example. The problem with interoperability is that, let's say in the messaging space, you would have fixed a couple of years ago, you would have fixed the technology that is interoperable, the interface, you know. Then WhatsApp comes along, or being challenged actually by Signal, because there is competition going on through multi-homing, and they're rolling out encryption overnight because the competitor did encryption. Encryption would have been possible with interoperability in the first place, yeah, because it wouldn't have been in the standard back then. So those actually, the incentives to innovate are much stronger if you're not interoperable. So you're asking for an alternative. The alternative is to push technologies and to push regulations which are encouraging multi-homing. So why not nudging, if you're on WhatsApp, nudging you, say, hey, there's an alternative messenger, and that's the regulation. You have to notify about the alternatives. You have to tell your friends are also on Signal and so on. You can use Signal, and then you can use that, and then that will actually supplant WhatsApp.
If there are alternatives.
And if there are alternatives. Messengers, there's plenty of alternatives. There's Threema, there's Signal, there's Wire, there's other stuff. Yeah.
Search.
So I'm going to
search is a different
pause
thing.
us on
search,
this
we don't want interoperable
scintillating debate, because I've got a feeling we could be here for several more hours, and I'm sure a number of you might want to pick it up in the next break. But Vittorio, just bringing in some slightly different themes that came up in a couple of the panels yesterday when interoperability was mentioned, also in the context of concerns about security and privacy, and how we potentially manage that sort of trade-off between opening up competition and ensuring privacy and security. Could you give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, of course there are technical issues, and well, if we are saying that things can be technically hard, well, it could be, but I also like this because that's why engineers like me have a job. So I mean, we are here to actually solve the technical issues, and I think they are solvable. Actually, we already have interoperable messaging systems with encryption and everything. I mean, there's Matrix, which is a system, an open source, open protocol system developed actually by a British company. There have been others in the past. There are also some for social media, like Mastodon. So it's not like technically these do not exist. They already do, and they work. It's just that they cannot get into the market, mostly because of the network effect and maybe lack of funding and marketing and whatever. But so, yes, there are objections about privacy. And it's true that if we imagine a certain point in which maybe WhatsApp has to open up and send messages to other companies, other service providers, there will be data that first were locked within the WhatsApp system, and they will go to other companies, other places. In the case of messages, I'm still pointing out that you, the sender, are the person who decides where they go. So if you don't want to message people that are using other applications, you will never be forced to do that. But on the other hand, you can also find ways to encrypt this communication. There are, if you take the web today, the communication on the web is encrypted with your browser and the servers communicate in encrypted ways because there is a mechanism, a technical mechanism at the beginning in which they decide which encryption they support, they exchange information, and they pick the best encryption possible for you. And this could just happen, again, when different messaging systems communicate. So it's nothing new. We already have it. But most importantly, even the encryption, the protection of the privacy when you transport information is not everything. So you can very securely send your information so that only WhatsApp has it, but then if once it gets encrypted, the supplier will just monetize your data and profile you, and then in the end you get no privacy. So the point is really which companies you want to give your data first in your first place as a user of a specific application. So if we introduce an element for competition, maybe I can stop using applications by certain companies that are known to have a business model which is based on tracking people, and I can pick other applications made by other companies. And by the way, even if maybe the users of the original application, the incumbent, will still get my messages because I will send them, at least they will not see what I do on the application, which is also very important. So tracking the time I spend, what I am looking at, this is especially important for social media, by the way. So there are ways to address these problems. And even the end-to-end encryption, there is indeed an issue, even in email. We've been working a lot to try to get end-to-end encryption properly. The reason why it's really hard to have proper end-to-end encryption even in email is not really related to email, it's related to the fact that we do not have proper identity management over the internet. So it's a separate problem because to encrypt something, especially for one specific person, you would need to get in a secure way the information on which encryption and key and whatever they are using. And this is the piece that is missing, and it's not connected to it being email or instant messaging or so. And this is something that is going to be addressed actually in Europe, partly with the IDAS, partly there are private sector solutions. Again, we're entering into another very concentrated market for identities. But still, it's a problem that we can solve, and actually this could be a good push to solve it. And finally, in terms of security, yes, of course, maybe some of these services will have to open up interfaces to the rest of the world. That is nothing different from basically what any web server is doing or whatever. So yes, you will have to secure your interfaces, but you already do it normally. And by the way, many of these services already have some kind of open interface. It's just that they do not open it to everyone. They only open it to other partners that either pay money or provide some very limited interoperable service, or that they control. So I really think that the technical issues can be addressed. We have to check how, but we will maybe discuss that later. But I think that it's just a matter for the techies.
That's really helpful, and I think really reassuring to hear that these are not sort of insurmountable obstacles. Yeah. But Cory, from your perspective, what do you see as the sort of main practical challenges, particularly, again, with those kind of lessons from history, I suppose?
Well, I think that there's a really hard administration problem with technical mandates, which is not to say that they should always be off the table. But the problem is, especially when you're talking about large incumbent firms that are already have the potential to expose users to a lot of risk and who stand between those users and harm, you do want those firms to exercise their duty of care. In fact, one of the reasons we're worried is that maybe sometimes they don't exercise that duty of care with the diligence that we'd like them to. And so if we say to Facebook, for example, you must open an API and allow third parties running Mastodon or Diaspora to connect to it, and Facebook says, we shut down the API yesterday because our intrusion detection system thought something bad was happening to our 3 billion users, you don't want to presumptively say, well, Facebook, you should be erring on the side of caution for continuity with this open API that we've mandated for you, even if it exposes 3 billion people to identity theft. You do want them to be prudent. And resolving the difference is such a fact-intensive question because after the fact, you need to find engineers who are qualified to understand Facebook's server infrastructure, who, to a first approximation, already all work for Facebook. And you have to ask them, was that a pretextual shutdown or not? Meanwhile, you get back to the same problem you had before, which is that in the interim, you're going to have people leaving the new market entrance and going back to Facebook. You're going to have investors abandoning it. And you're going to have individuals who found those firms quitting and maybe taking jobs at Facebook or somewhere else, exiting the field. And so you need something else. You need something that will prevent Facebook from defecting. And I think that's something that at Electronic Frontier Foundation, we started off calling adversarial interoperability, but that shortens to AI, and there's already something else called AI. We call it competitive compatibility, because saying ComCom is fun. So with ComCom is the basket of tools that engineers have used since the year dot to create interoperability where the incumbent didn't want to let them. So it's the reverse engineering, it's bots, it's scraping. And obviously you need some kind of digital human rights framework to compare this conduct to and say, did you scrape because you're Cambridge Analytica? Or did you scrape because Facebook shut down the API we forced you to operate, we forced them to operate and put your users at risk? Oh, okay, we can see, right? You've adhered to these universal principles that we hold Facebook to and that we hold new market entrants to. Your scraping was fine, your reverse engineering was fine, your bots were fine. So if we clear those legal obstacles, then we create a situation where if Facebook offers a good API and maintains it in good faith, they never have to contend with ComCom. And if they don't, then they enter the hell of guerrilla warfare with other engineers, right, who are sitting there exploiting the attacker's advantage to find new ways to get past the intrusion detection system and the firewall and offer new ways to connect to it, and you create unquantifiable risk for Facebook, which means that you create more opportunities for them to show up at their quarterly investor presentations and say, something we didn't expect happened last quarter. The last time that happened to Facebook in January, you'll recall that they lost $280 billion off their market cap. And the primary people who suffered that individually the most are the Facebook executives who are compensated in shares primarily. And as a consequence, those people, the people who would be the ones who make the decision to do something bad to the thing we've mandated, those people suffer the most if they do it, so you align their incentives as well. And then because nobody ever lost money betting against the hubris of tech leaders, if they go ahead and do it anyway, you've got a remedy. Not the perfect remedy, right? Not something that is stable over the long term. We heard before that scrapers and whatever, you have to keep retooling because it's cat and mouse. But you can provide continuity while the regulator goes and resolves that fact-intensive question. What happened when Facebook shut down the new market entrant? So this is a way to take the rigidity and strength of a mandate and the flexibility but kind of gooiness of reverse engineering and other guerrilla tactics and put them together like you would a two-part epoxy to make something that is both strong and flexible, resilient against all kinds of different attack modes, and one that can resolve questions like, is this a good API that Facebook is exposing? One of the ways that you can empirically test if it's a good API is if the new market entrants who are hoping to use it are instead devoting engineering hours to not using it. That's a really good prima facie indicator that Facebook's not offering what they need. And then you can go back and you can open an investigation or you can address how this can happen. And I think we've got one more chance to talk. I see I'm running out of time and I'll cede, but I do want to talk about how we create those legal protections for interoperators maybe later.
So let's try to pick this up in the last sort of topic because it's been a bit of a packed session as we anticipated. So I think kind of circling all of this together, you know, we've heard about the conceptual debate about when to introduce interoperability as a remedy. We've heard about some of the practical challenges, but I think I'm quite reassured, actually, that to some extent some of those are surmountable. But then there's a big question here about governance. And for a regulator, how do we deliver that? How much, as you say, Cory, can we kind of rely on the market having opened it up through interoperability, then the market to sort of deliver that as an effective outcome? Where does the regulator have to intervene? Going back to the discussion yesterday, how do we ensure that we're tooled up to do that? I'd like to just invite each of you perhaps just to offer a couple of quick thoughts on that, starting with Fiona.
Yeah. Cory raises a really important point. Again, Benedict Evans earlier said that the dominant firm always benefits from regulation. Dominant firms do not like interoperability because it enables consumers to leave. And that reduces monopoly profits, and so we can expect constructive disengagement. And I think this is why Cory's idea here is very clever. But I also think that you need a regulator standing in the background saying, no, if we've imposed interoperability as a mandate, then we're going to enforce it. And we've seen SSOs being captured by dominant firms and working against the interest of competition and consumers. So you really do need a regulator as part of the, similar to an SSO type structure, that's overseeing the interoperability. So I think that the combination of regulation and these kinds of market-based ideas is a really good idea. Let me just say also, again, Benedict Evans today, I was going crazy during his talk, told us all that if we had interoperability, Russian hackers would be able to take all our data. Under the DMA, of course, that is not true. It says with allowance for privacy and security, and we would expect to see a platform engaging in some kind of appropriate licensing permission type activity where you say, look, you want to interoperate, you have to go through some kind of background check or satisfy these 8 points or whatever. And again, the regulator needs to monitor that to make sure it's appropriate and not pretextual. But we all want that process to both exist and be robust so that the entities interoperating are the ones we expect to see there and creating new good options for consumers. So I think that's the sort of thing a government can do and perhaps not set up from soup to nuts, but be standing there monitoring to make sure it's being done in a pro-competitive way.
Thank you. Jan.
Thank you. So first, let me go one step back on the technical issues. There's one thing I really need to say on this is there's a big difference between designing a system newly from scratch. So if we could go every 5 years and design the internet completely new, design how messengers would work completely new, it's a different thing than trying to interoperate with existing systems. That's what we're having. Right? We're trying for 25 years, we're trying to switch from IP version 4 to IP version 6. Everyone agrees it's a good thing. Still, we're not having it. So it's a very, very different thing. So that's the first thing. So on the technical issues, I mean, Vittorio is right if we could design everything from scratch, but we're not there. We're having existing systems, existing incumbents. So on the governance issue, here there's also one thing we have to be very, very clear on, and this is, I think, where we have the fundamental disagreement. If you have a mandate for interoperability, you need very heavy-handed regulation. A regulator that has a very heavy hand, he has to impose certain technologies because it's a myth that you can make things interoperable for the messengers without compromising privacy and security. It's not possible. It's just a fact. It's not possible. So at least you have to compromise a little bit in security and privacy, and then who's going to be the arbiter of that? And of course, the incumbent, either it has an incentive to be interoperable in terms of vertical interoperability or whatever, then we don't need a regulator. Or it doesn't have an incentive, and then it will play all kinds of tricks, the sorts that Cory has said, in trying to make the interfaces bad, and trying to, the service is not running today, trying to prevent web scraping. So whoever who's want to build a business on that as an entrant, on that kind of flimsy interoperability, good luck. It's not going to happen, and the regulator is going to be too slow with that. And again, telecoms is a perfect example where it's a simple service, it's a very slow-moving innovation service, and yet all these kinds of problems were there, very much so, leading to the fact that despite we have interoperability between mobile and generally systems, the incumbents are still the incumbents. The incumbents that started out, they still have the market share because that competition in the market, network effects don't go away. And that's why I say, well, not do heavy-handed regulation here. There are more promising aspects of digital tech regulation which make much more sense, much less costly, and those you should tackle first, especially if you have in the European Union 80 people only working on it.
So Cory, I'd like you to come in, but also I wonder if we can wrap in one of the questions that has come in, because I think it's sort of on a similar theme. So the question talks about actually a scenario where industry players themselves are prepared to engage in interoperability, so it's not sort of fully mandated, fully imposed, but what should the role of regulators be in that situation? Should we be kind of encouraging, incentivizing industry participation, industry-led interoperability, or is there a role for the regulator even in that scenario? Perhaps you can kind of wrap that into some broader thoughts.
I will, and I want to just touch one last time on this question of messaging privacy and security, and just as a way of trying to resolve the conundrum, point out that there is no such thing as security or privacy in the abstract. That you can only be secure or private from something. The sprinkler system in the ceiling is not a burglar countermeasure. And when we say you have to give some up, really what we're just talking about is talking about whether you're exposed to privacy risks from third parties, from the firm itself, from states. There are lots of different risks that arise in an end-to-end encrypted messaging service. And when we say that there is going to be a change to that, it's not wrong. But I think that's a subject for a different day. But it gets into some very subtle questions of what we mean when we say this is a secure messenger, right? It's secure against what? The thing I want to take up, and it relates to what the question you just asked and what my earlier interventions, is how do we get to a point where it's lawful for new market entrants to go ahead and do that reverse engineering and scraping and bots and all the rest of it? And I think that we are at the tail end of a disastrous experiment in tech regulation where we tried to make the answer to the machine, right? Is there a copyright infringement problem on the big platforms? Oh, I know, we'll just make them build $100 million filters. Well, we still have a copyright infringement problem, and now you can't make the platforms any smaller because they need $100 million to operate that filter. Is there a terrorist content problem? Well, we'll make them build a filter for that. Is there some other harassment problem? Well, we'll make them do something about that. And what you do is you establish a baseline beneath which you cannot shrink them, because these important problems that are really the public's problems and that should be solved in democratically accountable ways are now the private purview of firms that act autocratically and that we have very little insight into. And when they say we failed because we gave it the old college try, we just have to take their word at it. And so what's a better way to get to the point where new market entrants can do things that we have historically allowed firms to police? We have a thicket of these laws that date back from this period. We have things like the anti-circumvention provisions of the European Copyright Directive, Article 6, which are also in the US law, Section 12.1 of the DMCA. We have the much narrower copyright CFAA. Gosh, I just blanked on. I've said that acronym so many times. Someone tell me what CFAA stands for. Thank you. I was having a stroke. We have the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. We have new theories about tortious interference with contract. We have all kinds of this whole thicket that sits between interoperators and doing this stuff on behalf of users. Legislative reform is a decades-long project, and we don't have time to wait. We should fix these laws, but it's going to take a long time. And I'll note, Electronic Frontier Foundation, we have litigation pending to overturn Section 12.1 of the DMCA on constitutional grounds. So maybe we'll fix that one. But then there's still all the rest. So how do we free up interoperators to do this? Well, I think one thing we can do is just wait for these companies to cheat, because they've always cheated and they will always cheat. And then as part of the settlement, we say, here is your special master. And whenever you attack a new market entrant using any of these theories, the special master reviews the litigation threat to make sure that it is bona fide and not a pretext to shut down an interoperator fulfilling the purpose of the law. And there's another really important lever that we have, and it's procurement. It is absolutely irresponsible that government agencies ever use public money to buy technology without extracting a binding covenant from that primary vendor, saying that secondary vendors can service it, improve it, and so on. Lincoln's Union Army only bought rifles from armorers that use standard tooling and ammunition for absolutely obvious reasons. And yet today, we have every school district in the world buying Google Classroom without extracting a promise saying we get to use third-party textbooks or third-party testing tools or third-party evaluation with it. I mean, we should just be telling the vendors, if you want to do business with the public, you have to enshrine the public interest. If they don't like it, they can go pound sand. And in the meantime, there's no way that you could roll out tools to that many customers, government customers at all levels, without it leaking into the private sector, which means that it would be a lost cause to try and block it. So those, I think,
Cory,
are our two big levers.
That's fantastic.
Thank
I just
you.
want to give Vittorio the very quick final word. As an engineer, what's the role for regulators?
Well, first of all, you should oversee the technical choice of standards. I think that the best solution technically is that all the players adopt the same open royalty-free standard. And that would also help, especially the smaller players, the open source projects, which don't have the possibility to implement like 10 different APIs or scrape the website of Facebook every day because it changes. But in terms of, I mean, the tech standards are to be made at the standardization organizations in which you're welcome to come, so it would be nice to see people. But you have to make sure that the output is checked against the public policy objectives, because the standardization organizations are of course, dominated by the biggest company that can send maybe 10 engineers into the room and direct the output of that. So there needs to be a role of oversight and check that the technical choices meet the public policy objectives.
Fantastic, and in time. You started saying that you couldn't keep to time, but you've done it perfectly. I just want to say a huge thank you to all four panelists. It's been an excellent debate. I'm sure it will be continued. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your caring. Sorry to go a little long there.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, panel. And we'll be back here at 4:20, please.